Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Janet Sears's play Harlem Duet. Now this is an Othello adaptation. It's a really interesting approach because it's a kind of prequel to Othello, which deals with Othello's imagined first wife, Billy, who's African American, because this is transported to the US. And it's divided into three different time periods. The South in 1860, where Othello and Billy are slaves. Harlem in the 1920s, where Othello is an actor, mostly doing sort of minstrel show type work, but ambitious to play Shakespeare, and contemporary Harlem, which in this case would be the mid-1990s, late 1990s. So what's interesting temporally is that the same basic plot line occurs over these three different time periods. We have Othello and Billy really devoted to one another, and then Othello leaving Billy for the white Desdemona, who shows up in different guises in each time period. And then Billy going through a sort of mental breakdown as she tries to cope with this. So, I mean, it's very much a postmodern adaptation in the sort of multi-temporality, in the sort of multi-layeredness of the play. But for me, I think the thing that's really, really interesting about Harlem Duet is the way that Othello's internalized racism is portrayed. Like, the impact that this internalized racism has. Because it's a play very concerned with African American and to a lesser extent maybe African Canadian, because Sears is a Canadian playwright, or she grew up in Canada. So it's very interested in African American psychology and the psychology of subjects who have consistently been subjected to racism. And Othello in contemporary Harlem, who's a university professor, very much has this internalized racism much more overtly than, say, Othello in Shakespeare, where we also do see that internalized racism, that sort of existential desire not to be black. And this is maybe most directly discussed in scene 3 of, I think, Act 2. Reasonably certain. Yeah. Act 2, Scene 3, which is actually set in Harlem in 1862. So this would be the characters from the South in 1860 who have now escaped to the North. In this bit, Othello has actually probably hanged himself. The stage directions say, so in 1860 the characters are called her and him, but they're Othello and Billy. Her holds him in her arms like Mary holds Jesus in Michelangelo's Pietà. There is a rope around his neck. He does not move. So we get the implication that he killed himself. And her says, once upon a time there was a man who wanted to find a magic spell in order to become white. After much research and investigation, he came across an ancient ritual from the caverns of knowledge of a psychic. The only way to become white, the psychic said, was to enter the whiteness. And he found his ice queen, his alabaster goddess. He fucked her on his dick. He, one with her for a single shivering moment, became her and her whiteness. So that's in a way, Othello's sort of central theme in this play is this desire to become white, and the failure to recognize that he'll never be seen as white by his white counterparts. And so, I mean, so this is building out of a lot of post-colonial theory. So Homi Bhabha, for instance, who's one of my absolute favorite post-colonial theorists, talks about mimicry. This is the term that he uses, in which a colonized subject performs whiteness or performs Europeanness. They mimic Europeanness. But Homi Bhabha very clearly points out they'll never actually be accepted as white or as European. They will always be seen as a character playing a part. And that's what we get with Othello. So like contemporary Harlem Othello, at one point he and Billy are talking about Christopher Iago, who's one of Othello's colleagues at Columbia. Iago, basically all that we find out about Chris Iago is that he's not a fan of affirmative action. And what we learn is that Othello is actually opposed to affirmative action as well. He says, using discrimination to cure discrimination is not, and then he gets cut off. But he says, injustice against blacks can't be cured by injustice against whites. So, I mean, Othello here has clearly internalized what is, generally speaking, a pretty racist argument against confronting structural inequalities. Later, he says in scene 9, I am not a minority. I used to be a minority when I was a kid. I mean, my culture is not my mother's culture, the culture of my ancestors. My culture is Wordsworth, Shaw, Leave It to Beaver, Dirty Harry. I drink the same water, read the same books. So again, what Othello does here is sort of confuses the trappings of white culture. Not that white culture is really a thing, but confuses the trappings of European and Anglo-American cultures with being white. That argument, I am not a minority. Well, the problem is that in the eyes of America, which remains an incredibly racist country, even 20-some years after this play premiered, no matter how cultured, and I say that in the sense of like elitist culture, in the sense of like, sorry, my cat's trying to climb onto my computer stand, so shove him off. In the sense of like going to opera and, I don't know, watching Shakespeare, talking about it around the water cooler, whatever it is. No matter how cultured you are in that high culture sense, if you are an ethnic minority, in the eyes of white American racism, you will continue to be a minority, you will continue to be uncultured. So Othello, again, confuses the sort of trappings of white culture with being white. And that's a central theme of this play. And we get it as well in Othello, in Shakespeare's Othello. But the thing that I find really interesting, actually, is the conclusion of Harlem Duet. Because Billy has a breakdown. She has a mental breakdown, and she's sent to a psych ward. And it's there that we start to see the reconstruction of an African American community. Because in a way, that's one of the things that Othello's internalized racism, his desire to be white, sort of undermines. It undermines that interconnected structure that he and Billy had, which had been built around sort of racial solidarity, working for African American equality and liberation and things like this. Because that's one of the things that we learn is that he had very much been sort of racial equality activist. She had been a racial equality activist, and they had both studied for this, or she's in the midst of studying for this. But when Othello leaves Billy, she has this mental breakdown. She goes to the hospital, and interestingly enough, in the hospital, a community of support begins really to coalesce for her. So she's initially taken to the hospital by Maggie, who's her landlord, who's there with her when she has this breakdown, and then Amma, who's Othello's sister, comes to the hospital to see Billy, and they build this connection through song, through this shared childhood song and dance. And then Canada, who is Billy's estranged father, comes to the hospital to see her. And interestingly enough, Billy uses the line that they'd used in the 1860 scenes, Canada, freedom come. Because in the 1860 scenes, Billy and Othello plan to escape to freedom in Canada. But here it takes on a new meaning. Canada becomes a family. Canada becomes a member of a community, of a racial community. And so Canada comes in as Amma is leaving, and the last line of the play, well, the last two lines of the play, Amma says, "We'll really miss you when you go back to Nova Scotia." And Canada says, "Oh, I don't think I'm going to be leaving anytime just yet, at least if I can help it. Way too much leaving gone on for more than one lifetime already." And then the play ends with Canada and Billy sitting together, and then joining in this song, the song that slightly earlier, Billy and Amma had sung together. So we have this unity both in Canada's decision to stay and support his daughter, but also in the singing. The sort of collective singing represents the unity between these characters, rebuilt along lines of solidarity, lines of family, in contrast to Othello's attempt to escape his identity, which again is doomed to failure.